via the press. So not via a newsletter that you sign up for or a listserv you're on or a friend talking about it, but via like radio or a morning news show or a magazine or newspaper, something like that. Tell me something that you heard about either in the chat or out loud. What's something that you recently heard news about? I put an example here in the screen that I recently heard about the Black Shutter podcast on NPR. It's a platform for Black photographers to share their stories, struggles, and achievements. And I'm also now seeing, Gally, do you have a recommendation? If I have my PowerPoint in presentation, I cannot see chat. So for now, I'm just going to do this so that I can perhaps see what you all are doing. Nope, still can't. Any suggestions?
I can help with the chat. I'll just read the chat out.
Okay.
Well, first of all, Matt says, this is a disappointingly hard question. Catherine's sharing New Orleans marching bands, dancers, and social clubs helping get people out to get their vaccines via the New York Times. Matt actually again says, I heard a lot about the NFT stuff and the Beeple and WAPO, Guardian, and NPR. Anthony, and then Margie Waller is saying, Anthony McGill playing a concert at the Met in the art, and I read about it in a magazine. Keith Tolan is bringing up the mural project in Columbia, South Carolina, highlighting local African-American history. And that one doesn't say exactly where it's from, but yeah, there you go.
Awesome. Thank you all. I wanted to begin with that just to kind of get you started thinking about where people are communicating their work. And a lot of times in this kind of setting, we're often thinking about communicating your value to a really particular audience, like it's just like my funder, or who do I want to maybe be a participant? And those are the only people that we're communicating. And thinking about like what you've seen in the news could be a way to think about, okay, like what am I hearing and seeing other places? How do I come across interesting news stories in my own life? So here's a quick overview of what we're doing today, talking about framing, how we think about how we communicate, a bit of background and examples for you, just to kind of get a bit of a solid foundation, talk a bit about evaluation and data. What do they mean? What can they mean? Do a little bit of co-brainstorming, hopefully, to get you some actionable material before you leave this session today, and then ending with some hot tips, because everyone needs some, and hopefully you all can add your own at that time also. So getting started with framing, and this is where everything starts, because we all get to decide how we want to think about communicating a project's value. Is it something we have to do? Is it something we choose and are excited about? Is it weird and awkward? Is it kind of like an afterthought or a hoop jumping scenario? Or is it totally in keeping with our art and with our core interests and our core values as people who are part of a creative industry? As creative as artists are and as creative as art is, some arts organizations and programs can be surprisingly unimaginative when it comes to communications. And that's not necessarily their fault. It's because the process has so often been framed as a have to instead of a part of. Like it's framed as what you do after you've done the magical, interesting thing, instead of being the magical, interesting thing itself, or part of the magical, interesting thing. So my goal is usually to get artists to bring their imaginations, their creativity, their innovation, their perspectives to their own framing of what this whole endeavor involves, or could involve, or should involve. For example, what is communication? Is it the same thing for everyone? What are some of the many kinds of communication? What are some of their many varied purposes? Like even if we say that the purpose is to communicate your value, what are some of the many ways that different forms of communication do that? What different purposes would using different forms of communication serve, even if the overarching purpose is to communicate your value? And if we're thinking about communicating value, what is value to whom? You know, what are the myriad ways that somebody could communicate value? This is a prompt. This is like, as an artist myself, as a performer myself, as a creative writing instructor, and as a public health scientist who does program evaluation, this is my creative prompt for you. What are the myriad ways in which someone could communicate value? Like that could mean so many different things. So to give you a bit of background about me, why I'm here talking about this and why I care about it so much. My first career was in pop music. I made my living as a singer-songwriter for a lot of years. And I can tell you the story later about how I wound up in public health. If you want, you can ask later. But as a musician, I never thought that press and publicity was this thing I had to engage with, either, you know, because somebody was making me or because I needed it in order to justify or validate my work as a musician. I didn't think that my music was more valuable or valid if somebody wrote about it or wrote an article about it. Instead, I just saw press as something I had to get if I wanted to interact with audiences and if I wanted to grow my work. And interacting and growing were two really important goals for me, both because as an artist, I wanted to share my work with people. And as a business person who really wanted to pay my rent, I wanted that to grow. I wanted to be able to envision that 3 years from now, I might be less worried about whether my income would be able to cover my rent and meals than I am now, right? I wanted it to grow. And so media and press and publicity was the way that that happened. If I'm going to go to Chicago for the first time as a musician, and I started my career before there was a whole bunch of social media, right? So if you're going to get somebody to come out to your show, you have to have some way to connect with them before you show up there. It has to be a weekly newspaper writing about you, or a radio station playing a song and being like, hey, guess what? They're going to be in town this weekend. So this was always just part of being able to do what I wanted to do. There were times that, like, you know, we were driving all night to get to a 7 a.m. morning news spot, and I really wished I didn't have to do that. But at the same time, it is always such an honor to be able to talk about my work and to perform, even if it was at 7 o'clock on a weird sound stage next to somebody cooking for the next segment over there. Like, it was weird, but it was always interesting and part of what I was doing. It was just part of being a pop musician, right? So later, I started this program called Project Uncaged, and it's a creative writing based, a trauma-informed program for girls that are incarcerated. And my history in pop music combined with my later work in public health is centered on health equity and the social determinants of health. Those things had huge impacts on what I saw as the goals of this work and the purpose of it. And then also, which I'll talk about, the communications possibilities for communicating the value of that work. So to give you a little bit of background for how this took shape, I started doing this work because I was invited to be a writer in residence for girls at a juvenile detention facility in Ohio. And that program was really cool. They wrote, similar to Project Uncaged, they did creative writing with young women. They also did visual art and sometimes choreography. And they always made books of the girls' poems. And every girl who had written, she got a copy of the book. The funder got a copy of the book. The juvenile justice judge that had allowed the program to be created got a copy. The facility itself got a copy. So they would make, you know, every time they had this program, they would maybe make like 25 or 30 copies of the book. And they had initiated this program because a women-centered philanthropic organization had said, hey, can we work with you to do something with arts with the girls that are incarcerated? And so they created a girl-centered program. They didn't create the program based on like research about girls' unique needs in the system or unique pathways to and through the system. When I came on board, I had that research, and I knew that in a lot of jurisdictions in the United States, even since 1999, the federal government has been saying we lack equality. The system was designed for cis hetero males, and it still functions for that population. And even though girls and LGBTQ youth and gender and non-binary and non-conforming youth have different needs, the system is not meeting those needs. Our federal government has been saying that for a couple of decades, and still most jurisdictions, if you were to call your local juvenile detention facility and say, do you have a program that's specific or services specific to girls? They're likely to say no. This is a kind of invisible population, despite the fact that it's also the fastest growing population in the US juvenile justice system. So when I showed up in this space, that's what I was thinking of. And as a pop musician who had, you know, made records and tried to sell them as much as I could, when I held the books in my hand that this organization had made, the first thought I had was, why doesn't everybody have this book? Why isn't this on some platform where people can come and buy it and learn more? Why aren't we sending this to like 200 people, not just 20 people? And it was just a difference in how I was framing the project itself. What I understood, the organization I was working with saw it as primarily unidirectional. We were taking something into girls and providing something for them that they wouldn't have otherwise. And I saw it more as like, yes, we're doing that. And then also girls have a lot to say and we have a lot to learn. So there's this multi-directional process that I was envisioning that changed what I thought of the program itself, but also what I thought of the deliverable, and also having a whole bunch of ideas of like, who would be contacted, what reporters might be interested in this story, how can we get people to jump on this? And in saying all this, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that everybody has to have some kind of structural change in mind or some kind of policy reform you're trying to get to happen in order for communications to become more interesting or less onerous or something like that. Those goals are not going to be appropriate for every single person that's doing this kind of work. But what I am saying is that we get to choose. We get to choose what we think of as the point of our communications, why we think we're communicating our value at all, what's the goal or the possibility of it, and how we feel about that process is going to influence how good the communication is. So if you can choose a reason for communicating that makes you feel good and inspired, it's going to make the communications better anyway. So this question, I'll just let you sit with it for a second. With your project as it is right now, how are you potentially thinking small? The project that I worked with in Ohio was not thinking small. To be very fair to them, they're incredibly innovative and creative and have done a lot of things for a small city in Ohio that many other huge organizations haven't ever thought to do. But with this one particular project, they really saw it as pretty small. Like I said, unidirectional, a few books sent to a few different people. They didn't realize they were thinking small. It's not because they were stupid. They just needed somebody from the outside to be like, ah, have you guys ever thought of doing X, Y, Z? And once it's shown to them, it's sort of like, you can't unsee it. You're like, of course we should be doing that, right? Sending the books to the mayor's office with a list of resources that girls claimed that they needed in their poems and directing them to their specific poems. There's so many things that you can do once somebody turns the light on. So what are some ways that you're thinking small? Oftentimes what keeps communication small and uninspired is not a lack of budget or even a lack of platform. Sometimes we think that organizations that have a huge platform are just going to do better because they have the way to do it. Often it's just imagination. And this is really hard for arts organizations in particular to hear because we pride ourselves in being imaginative. We don't want somebody to say, the reason your communications is failing is because you don't have as much creativity or imagination as you could have, right? But that's often what it is. What do you imagine the purpose of your work is? Is that all that it is? Could it be more? Are you so in the weeds with it that you can't see that it could actually be 50 other things without even changing? This organization, I'm using it as an example because they didn't have to change a single thing about what their program was in order to do much more with it. They didn't even have to add much to the budget. The difference between printing 25 books and printing 250 isn't actually that much money. They didn't have to change anything. It was just imagination. But then obviously, when it comes to formal evaluation, how is your conception of that small? If you're thinking beyond press or beyond deliverables or things you might want to create, how might you be also thinking small about that? So I'm going to spend just a bit of time on that today. And I'll start by saying when it comes to grant-funded, I'll go back to this. When it comes to grant-funded arts programs or initiatives, oftentimes when we say communicating your value, it gets conflated immediately with formal evaluation and data collection. That's just, people think that we're talking about the same things. So you probably guessed that I'm pushing against that. Those are not the same things. But I'll also push against the idea that even providing evidence for your value has to necessarily have anything to do with evaluation or data collection. What is evidence? It depends on who's asking, right? It depends on who you're trying to persuade. And I say this not because I don't think formal program evaluation is important. Like, that's a big part of what I do with my career at the intersection of arts and public health, but it's a lot more than people think that it is. So a few ideas. First, evaluation can mean a lot more and be a lot more creative than we often think. That's thing number one. A formal evaluation isn't always the most effective way to communicate or even prove your value. And it always comes down to, what is evidence or proof? And the thing that these three things have in common is that they all circle around audience. Audience. Who is your audience? How you define evidence, the choice of whether to collect data or conduct a formal evaluation, the choice of how you do either of those things if you choose to, all of that is going to come down to who your audience is. So this is the way they think about making decisions about communication. You start with your audience. Making a list, I'll give you a worksheet later, help you do this. A list of all of your audiences. You have multiple distinct audiences, whether you've made a concrete list of them before, not urge you to make a concrete list of them. Who all needs to know about the value that you offer? Can anybody throw some out either in chat or using your voice? What are some of your audiences who need to know about your value? Do we have any? Nobody has audiences.
Coming in. The mayor's office.
Ooh, awesome.
The skeptical neighbors. Community partners, stakeholders, and participants, said Rebecca in Omaha. Older adults, artists, and funders, Emily Thays at the Dance Exchange.
Awesome. Yeah, oftentimes your potential participants, sometimes their caregivers or whoever's making decisions for them can be another audience in addition to your participants, policymakers.
We've got a few more coming in too.
Awesome, please.
From Yoko, clients from the recovery program that we serve. From Mary, residents, students, visitors, children in schools with families. And in Baton Rouge, Mary also saying cheerleaders and board members.
Oh yeah, if you get yourself some good cheerleaders, they go into all the other places for you, right? I'm assuming you're not meaning like an actual cheerleading squad someplace like I might have been mistaken, but so yeah, great. So all of these different audiences are going to care about different things, right? The thing that your funder cares about might actually be slightly different than the thing that your participants care about. Hopefully they're the same, but all these different people that you listed are going to have some slightly different things they care about. So you establish all of your audiences for each one of those audiences. What are the things they care most about when it comes to your particular project or program? Where are those people? Where do they show up? What do they read? What do they watch? What do they listen to? Because that's going to be where you need to show up if you're going to want to communicate with them. And then from that, you can develop what are going to be your deliverables? What kind of press are you going to try to get? What kind of report are you going to need to create? For whom? Who's going to need that? If a funder is one of your audiences and you need to communicate your value to your funder, like if that's part of the stipulation, that may still not mean that you need to conduct a formal program evaluation. There are many ways to communicate your value. If you take one thing away from this workshop, that should be it, that there are many ways to communicate your value and you can be curious about it, stay imaginative about it. I won't be telling you how to do it prescriptively. My goal is more to stimulate your creativity when it comes to doing it. That said, if you do have to collect data of some kind in order to evaluate your program, here are some things that I would want to leave with you. A couple TASHA definitions of evaluation is just answering the question, did this do what we said or hoped it would? That's all that it is. That's all an evaluation has to be. It can also be much more than that. If you're going to get basic, did this do what we said or hoped it would? And what is data? Pieces of information that contribute to decisions, perspectives, or courses of action. These definitions are meant to keep things really wide open. Some people define data as facts or collections of facts, but obviously we know that things exist like falsified data or incorrectly analyzed data or decontextualized data, right? So it's not always having to do with facts. But there are so many ways that you can answer this question. Did we accomplish what we set out to do? Did this program do for people what we hoped it would do for them? And as a program evaluator, from my perspective, what I love about these questions is that they require you to know what it is you're hoping or trying to do, to have a really clear idea of it. You have to get clear, concrete, confident about what you're up to. What is it that you hope your participants or the community experiences or feels or learns or gains from the fact that you exist, from the fact that they might get to interact with you? Do you know those? And can you list them off, ABC, super quickly? If not, that is why communicating your value is hard for you, because you don't know what it is. And that's the core thing. You have to get clear and believe that you have a value to offer. If you don't know what you offer, then communicating your value will be hard for you because you don't know what it is. It's really pretty simple. And remember that your value might be different from your official goals. From my perspective, I think these things should be really similar. But sometimes it can help stimulate something for you. If you take your goal statement that your organization probably has, or your vision statement, or whatever you submitted to NEA as being the mission or vision for this project, and rewrite it as something like, The value we offer our participants is fill in the blank. The value we offer our community is fill in the blank. The value we offer society is fill in the blank. And again, this shouldn't be completely alien from the goals that you already have, but framing it in this way can help stimulate a new way of recognizing, right? Re-seeing your own project in a slightly different way that might give you different ideas. And of course, sometimes you do want to find out what it is, like if you do know what you're trying to do, the best way to find out what that is to ask your participants. That's the most obvious way. Sometimes it doesn't quite apply depending on the kind of program you have. We can chat about that later. But this can be via surveys, interviews, focus groups, feedback forms, or art. Often this process just feels like doing what you do, but then being humble and participatory enough to elicit some feedback. Sometimes it can be as simple as that. Qualitative data are data. Brene Brown calls them calls stories data with soul. A lot of times the organizations that I work with, especially arts-based organizations, they worry that what they do isn't quantifiable. And often it is, just not in the typical ways that they might be used to hearing about. But here's the thing, not being able to quantify your work is not an automatic problem. There's an assumption that quantification is the expectation, but I'll be honest with you, I suspect that's true far less often than we assume it is, even from really conventional funders. And that's me from a public health sciences perspective. If the requirement is, if somebody has said to you, prove that you did what you set out to do, if they've said that to you in some way, and if you're interpreting that as now I have to quantify my work, that's on you. They never told you that you have to quantify what you do. You interpreted prove my value as now I have to quantify it. And that interpretation is on you. And that's okay. This is process of imagination, opening it back up and asking what is evidence? It can be witnessing, feeling, watching, hearing, a sense of getting a sense of how people are advocating or lobbying something, a story. Sometimes the proof comes in making somebody feel something. And obviously there are huge exceptions to this. I'm well aware of that. Sometimes we do need statistics. We need some other processes. Sometimes we need biomarkers and things like that. In those cases, there are options, but a lot of times we've just kept our conception of evidence really small. And I'll give you a quick interlude that big part of my work in public health is looking at art itself as a form of data. Kind of grounded in this idea from Sontag that whatever is happening via our quantitative statistical data, something else is always going on, and we have to be able to see. Sontag wasn't talking about art as data. She was I just steal her quote because it's relevant. But I conduct arts-based research about any research question that you might give me. For example, I used arts-based research to learn about young women's experiences and perceptions of violence. And that wasn't because I was running an arts program or because they were involved in, participants were involved in one. It's because art can tell us a lot of things that other data sources can't. So as a really quick rundown, I'm happy to talk about this more later. Here's some benefits of arts as a form of data. If you look to art as data, it's a safer sharing experience, especially if the topic is sensitive or stigmatized. You want to give people choice, accessibility, and creative options when they're talking about that difficult experience. It can make less researcher intrusion. What can I learn about a topic without having to go back to the population and ask them questions that they may have already answered with the art that they create that already exists in a community? It can give you different information. There's different ideas and insights that emerge from art than can come out just via conventional conversation or surveys. Art, obviously, you all know this, creates platforms for amplification. So like when I publish books of girls' poems in Project Uncaged, their word gets to go out in their own voices, and the dissemination is their own work instead of somebody else codifying it and creating some new report out of it. And then there's also a potential for reciprocity. Like if somebody is doing an arts-based program in order to provide data, then they're getting some health benefits from participating in a creative activity. They might be learning about something that they wanted to learn more about. They might get a public platform that they might have wanted. So these are just 5 benefits of arts-based research that I use in public health. So just to give you an idea that when you are collecting data or needing to know something about your program, if people are creating art as part of your program, you might already have the data inherent in it. You might not have to do anything different. Again, it might just be a matter of how you're imagining what data is and what counts as evidence, what counts as data. Whether you formulate art as data or not, there's a couple things that you can do moving forward that will help. First, demystify the process. Evaluations aren't about trying to quantify the unquantifiable, which I hear all the time from artists. They're not about trying to reduce art to a formula. They're not even about enforcing the hierarchy of science over arts and the humanities. At least they don't have to be. They're usually just about answering really specific questions. So that's the first thing, demystify the evaluation process. It's just about showing if you're doing what you hoped that you were doing. And then accept limitations. When conducting an evaluation, you're going to need to choose one or just a few questions to answer. You won't be sharing all of the ways your program can possibly help human beings. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that the rest of your work doesn't count. An evaluation is just a particular thing that serves a particular purpose. Not everyone who's interested in your program will care equally about all the same things. So for example, if you have a funder that really cares about like one thing to the complete exclusion of everything else you do that you value, there's not necessarily a problem there. Just communicate what that funder needs to know about that thing that they care about, and then communicate all of the rest of your awesomeness to everybody else in the world. Nothing has necessarily gone wrong there. But here is the thing. If you are not limiting your communications to a single evaluation or report, you won't be so worried about whether that single report tells your entire story. When people get angry at funders for only caring about two things or a small slice of this huge pie of what they do, it's usually because that's the only person they're talking to about their work, and they want to be able to convey all of the amazing things that their project does, right? If you stop putting so much pressure on that one piece of communication that you're offering, and you recognize that everybody else might want to know about all these other things you're doing, then you're going to free yourself up so much to stop making the stakes so high about that one report. What if you accepted that no single audience is ever going to know everything about who you are and what you do? You probably don't know everything about who you are and what you do, right? If you accepted that, what would that open up for you? What could you choose to tell each of the audiences that might be interested in your work? So as a quick example, and then we'll do some breakout group brainstorming time. I mentioned Project NK just providing a little bit of an example. So going through the audiences scenario, the same track that you saw earlier, some of my audiences beyond the participants themselves were policymakers, judges and probation officers and facility staff who make really concrete, immediate decisions about girls' lives and experiences, the broader community, leaders and voters, educators in the community who interact with girls, and obviously the funders that might be able to make this work continue. So for each one of those, we've had to go through a process of what do they care about? What does a policymaker care about? They care about things like recidivism. They care about being seen by their community or constituents in certain ways. They care about feeling like they're doing something about a project or about a situation or issue in their community. So anyway, for each of those audience members, what do they care about? Where are they? How do I reach them? And then how am I going to create a deliverable or do something in the press or make a report that's going to reach them? For policymakers, with our work in Louisville, Kentucky, when we publish books of girls' poems, we also always write a policy brief along with that, taking things that girls have written about, taking issues and policies that might address those, and then sending them to city council members, the mayor's office, state representatives, and more, saying like, here's the policy brief that you could, here's the policy that you could change, and here's some examples of girls whose lives would be changed by that. Or the other way around, you're gonna read this book and care about this population and wonder what you can do for them. Here it is, here's the policy that you could vote for or present in order to make their lives better. So for each of these audiences, we thought of that. For deliverables, we didn't create a different deliverable altogether. Like these programs that we have always have a book. So I didn't choose to like not do a book based on a specific audience. But because some of these audience members aren't going to just read a book because there's a book, we did think of things like how can we create an event where we would invite some of these people to come be a part of the event. And then they would have to read the poems because they've been invited to be a part of the event where the poems are being read. And then it helps them to be interested in the book in a different way. So I'll show you a bit about that. Here's some books that we published in Louisville. The international literary publisher, Sarah Band Books, is here, and we work with them to publish books, which is great because you get access to their network and to their dissemination. It can be online. They got it into local bookstores and things like that. And we also developed an ongoing program. So sometimes these programs are like specific time period, like a week or a few weeks. The program in Louisville became ongoing, twice a week in the jail, working with girls in writing. And we published this book, One Day I'll Rise, from that first ever ongoing program. It was also the first ever program designed specifically for girls in this Louisville facility. So when the book came out, we wanted to do a big launch, like when a book is published and you do a big author reading or something like that. But of course, these girls can't read their own work on a stage outside the facility. And even if they had been free by the time the book came out, we wouldn't want them to disclose their status as somebody who had been justice involved, right? So we sought some other people who could take the stage for them. So these really well-known performers and musicians in Louisville invited 1200 and Daniel Martin Moore, spoken word artist Hannah Drake, cellist and singer-songwriter Ben Soley to perform the girls' work. So they set them to music or perform them themselves. And we also invited State Representative Attica Scott, the director of the juvenile detention facility herself, came and read poems. Somebody from the mayor's office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods came and read poems from this book. And the fact that these people were involved playing what became like original music from them, right? But it's putting the girls' words to music. We packed that venue with standing room only. The Weekly wanted to tell the story about it because it's an interesting story itself. Like the book coming out is a story, a human interest story, but the people that were involved were a huge story. And because it was such a successful event, the Courier-Journal became interested and asked if they could shadow me for a few months and wrote this story about it, sent a videographer to like interview about it. It became a Sunday feature story in their paper, and then the Associated Press picked it up. And the girls that I worked with were so proud of this because the article included quotes from their poems, right? And that went so much further than something that just I could have done, but also just the sense of efficacy, like, oh, if I write something, these people might actually read it. It could really go someplace. The sense for themselves of imagination of where their work can go was such a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop back into the program itself. And I want to share this in part to give you some ideas for your own work, which might obviously be super different, but also to say that when I do this work, do I have to present statistics to funders anymore? When I ask to do this work, when I approach a new detention facility and say, would you be interested in hosting a program like this? They're not asking me for formal evaluations anymore. I can show them all of this press. I have a stack of books from previous facilities. I have stacks of testimonials from previous participants who've written about their experience and from previous facility directors. So proof, what is evidence, right? And to whom does it matter? And sometimes when you can do some great communications, you can get some great evidence that pushes you forward for the next funder or the next opportunity. So to take a few minutes to brainstorm for you and to get a break from my voice, I want you to spend a little bit of time. I think we have at least 12 minutes for this, so maybe a little longer. You're going to be sent into breakout groups. Thank you, Gali, for your help with that. But first, individually, spend just a minute, and you guys can police time together. I don't know how you're going to do it, but spend a minute, just a minute, listing your own audiences on your own and your own current deliverables. And if you need some help thinking of what deliverables are, let me know, send me a chat or something. So your current deliverables. And then once everybody has done that, again, just a minute on your own, then take 45 seconds or less and describe your project for the rest of your group and include the audiences and deliverables from the list you just made. And the goal is for the rest of the group to be able to give you some feedback of like, what are they hearing from you that you might not be picking up on your own? Is there another deliverable that you might be able to consider based on what you're creating already? Is there an audience that you haven't thought of? What might that audience be most interested in if this person reaches out? What kind of press do you imagine that person could get? The point is that sometimes we're all so in the weeds with our own project that we can't see it for ourselves anymore. So getting a little bit of outside perspective. So I will stop sharing here.
And I'm just going to jump in real quick before Gali puts you into your rooms. If you look at the chat, you'll see all of those questions that Tasha just had up on the slide. So when you go into your breakouts, you'll be able to reference them in the chat.
Thank you.
Tasha, so good.
Hey, welcome back, y'all. Feel free to take yourself off mute if you think that you might have something to share. But we're hoping to hear from each of the groups just something that stood out to you or something that came up that you just guys chat about. Nothing specific or prescriptive, but just take a minute for each group. So who wants to go first? Share something that came up for you. Oh, the enthusiasm. It's amazing. I would pick somebody, but I don't know how the groups were delineated. Jamie, thank you.
Yes, I'm going to jump out there. My group was myself and Mary and Jarlene. And one thing that, first of all, Mary saved the day for Jarlene and myself, just, helping us to, spark an idea. And, the main thing that stood out for me in particular that Mary said was to give a surprise, like a surprise and a delight. We were discussing trying to get, buy-in and engagement from the community and the people that you want to participate with you. And she mentioned that an artist that they're working with named Matthew Mazzata had done some outdoor living room setups and just surprised, like here it is out of nowhere. And I just thought that was amazing. And also just taking some anxiety off of us as well, giving us ideas about, talking to, the agency that gives out the grant about any struggles that we're facing, just like this, not just coming to these workshops, but bringing it to their attention so that they can help us readjust the way that we're doing our funds or the way that we're structuring our activities.
I love it. Thank you so much. Surprise and delight. Those are always great words to have in mind. What about another group? Rebecca, yeah.
I can speak. So Yoko and I were speaking, and I think that not necessarily a solution, but just a common challenge that both of us have, or that our programs have national recognition and national acclaim, but we're having a challenge getting our community to really know what our programs are doing, especially because they're both sort of private. They're not really open to the public to participate in them necessarily.
Yeah, anybody else have a similar issue that came up?
I think in our group, which was Mary from Baton Rouge and Cyan in Kansas, had the kind of the opposite problem, talking about a project where there was a lot of local engagement, especially great press from local sources, but in the kind of proximate metropolitan areas, or one of the purposes of the project is kind of to connect folks across rural and urban space, that it was harder to get picked up, harder to get the word out in those urban places.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Somebody from, I think we still two groups we haven't heard from, is that correct?
Yeah, so we had really inspiring projects that we were able to share. And I think the thing that stood out was at least two of our projects. One, I think we've already heard about how COVID needs have kind of encouraged different modes of story collection to ensure their already planned collaborative process, but both of them really had a lot of story collecting as part of their current efforts. And I think they're aware that they're getting a lot of resources that they can use for this sort of work.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. And our last group?
Sure, I can share for us. I think one thing that was inspiring to me out of our conversation was around how the artists who are involved in our project can be advocates for the project, and how they can help to shape the way that the project is moving forward. I know Ashley was saying how they don't want to have a sort of preconceived notion of how the project is going to go. They want the artists to really be instigators for that. And yeah, just helped me to think about how the artist cohort that's involved in our project can also help connect us to new networks that maybe we haven't already been interacting with or already been thinking about.
That's great. Thank you all so much. I hope that the conversations were in some way encouraging or inspiring, or at least like a sense of, in this time, you know, whatever sense of isolation we might be feeling, that somebody else is maybe going through something similar, or somebody else has been where I am, or has a word about my experience or situation that I couldn't come up with on my own. So obviously, as Lynn said at the beginning of the call, feel free to reach out to each other after this again, or to other people on the TA team to, if you have a specific thing that you're like, oh, I would like to investigate that further. I wouldn't have thought of that beforehand, but we should ask more questions about that. Like, feel free to keep asking questions about it. And to wrap up, I'm gonna share my screen again. And we did some brainstorming. We got to think about some hot tips. I don't really know how hot they are, y'all, but I'm going to try my best. You can tell me later. But first, for different types of audiences, if you're looking at a public audience and not like if the audience isn't your funder or your board or something like that, right? Then get specific. Which publics are you trying to reach? What do they read or watch or listen to? What interests or motivates them? What do they need in their lives? So sometimes when I'm doing brainstorming activities with organizations or with people, and they say that one of their audiences might be the media, I'm always like, oh, that is a terrible answer. That doesn't count. The media doesn't count, because you want to say, like, it's not a monolith, right? There is no the media. What specific outlet are you trying to reach? What specific newspaper or online platform? What specific reporter even do you want to try to get interested in your project? What specific morning news show or evening news show? What specific local cable channel? All of those things, because that will change what you send to them, how you reach out. And spoiler, if it doesn't change what you're reaching out, you're probably doing a bad job when you reach out. Your pitch letters have to change depending on who you're communicating with, right? So get really specific. Which particular publics do you want to reach out? And it can be more than one. And then where is that particular one reading their news or watching? What are they watching? What are they listening to? How can you show up in those specific spaces? So beyond public audiences, if it's your funder or your board or something like that, then you can still be really specific. Which members do you really have to communicate with or persuade or convince, right? If there's one person, we've all worked with like a board where like everybody's on board, sorry to use the pun, but except for like there's one person who's skeptical, right? Then that might change how you choose to communicate, because you're trying to really persuade that one person. But in general, the whole board or the funding organization, whatever it is, what do they truly need to know about what you do? Do they need to know everything about what you do? What would actually hit them? What would hit for them? And that you're going to answer that question by asking what drives them? What is their mission or vision as a funding organization, or as a single person working at a funding organization, or as a board, or as a single person serving on a board? What do they really need to know about what you do? And again, no single audience needs to know everything about what you do. You can try to do that. Sometimes it's appropriate to try to do that. Depends on the audience, right? And then your deliverables. What are you already making? You made a list of this, hopefully, with your group time. What are you already producing or creating? And what's maybe a new way to think about that would make it reach more people? And make sure dissemination is in your budget from the very beginning. I know it might be too late for some people who already got some grant distribution, but it's part of the art in the project, not an afterthought. So I'm gonna use the pop music example again. When people say, I'm gonna go write an album, they know from the beginning that they want that album to eventually land on Spotify someplace, right? They want you to be able to find it. They want it to be on YouTube eventually. They're thinking about dissemination when they're creating, not necessarily when you're writing every single song. It's not a good way to write songs, but you're thinking about where you want that to go from the very beginning. That's gonna make budgeting and the whole process a lot easier over time. This is so important, y'all. Lower the stakes. Try a bunch of things. Try a bunch of things. If you contact 10 people, you might get 1 or 2 responses. If you try 10 things, 1 of them might work, but that's better than using that same amount of time to sit around deliberating over the best thing that you could do. And then you have nothing to show for that, right? Or then you have one thing that you try. And if that one thing fails, then everything is effed, right? So try a bunch of things, lower the stakes. It's okay to put yourself out there. This is my big message too. Stop searching and talking and waiting for the perfect fail-proof idea before you do something. It doesn't exist. And even if it did exist, you're not going to find it in a vacuum sitting around a conference table or on a Zoom call. You're going to find it by trying things and failing and iterating and doing something different the next time, right? Remember also, to lower the stakes, that people contact news organizations and reporters and funders and anchors and community leaders all the time. It's really not a big deal. It might feel like a big deal if you don't do it very often, if it's the first time that you've done it, and that's okay. That's also normal, but that doesn't mean that it legit is a big deal to the person on the receiving end, right? You're part of this normal thing that happens for them. Remember that they need a story. Often, if you're talking to people in the press, right, or people at a radio station or a news station, they need a story and you have one. It's mutually beneficial. That said, you don't want to overdo it. So we'll get that in a second. But remember that it's not just, again, it's not just one direction. You're asking them to do a favor for you. You're also providing something that they probably need as well. And like all artists, expect rejection. It's often about timing, news cycles. It's the personnel you're reaching out and their specific interests. It can be about current events and context. It might not be about you or about the content you're offering them. So just try again. Artists know that when you reach out to a new audience or a publisher or reporter, you might not hear back at all. You might get rejected. So that's fine. On to the next. It doesn't mean anything. You just try again. And again, that said, don't overdo it. Reach out when you have a new compelling story or a particular new artifact or a particular important event that differs markedly from the others. We were just saying during the brainstorm session that like playing a show for a musician is not a story. That's what you do all the time. So don't contact the news being like, I'm gonna play a show in your city. Who cares? What's the hook, right? So what's new about it? Did you just release an album and this is your first show in the city since that album came out? You know, are you playing a show with a new artist you've never played a show with before? Like there has to be a reason why you're reaching out to the news about something. What's the hook? And the bonus of this is that if you do this consistently, then local press will learn that when you reach out, you have a story they can go with. And that's a great reputation to build over time. Prepare for your appearances. If you get invited to do an interview, whether it's live or recorded, but if your voice is going to be heard or you're going to be seen, prepare for it. And by that, I mean, choose wisely. When you hear about local happenings on say like a morning news show, often what pulls a listener or viewer in is the interviewee's own interest in their subject matter. Even if you'd never heard of it before and didn't think that you were going to be interested in that thing, if the person is wildly interested in it, it makes you kind of want to lean in and be like, what are they on about, right? So artists and arts organizations have a leg up in this because we tend to really care about what we do. And when we talk about it, the enthusiasm can be contagious. But that said, don't assume that just because you're enthusiastic about what you do, that you're the most obvious and best person to send into an interview setting. Sometimes the mistake that places make is that they think that the leader of an organization, the executive director, or even the lead artist of a project is the best person to put into an interview scenario. And that's not always the case at all. It could definitely be, but find the person who's the most contagious or charismatic when they're talking about this work, or the person who's the most calm yet persuasive, right? Or the person who knows how to keep things simple, or the person whose energy wakes people up. Notice that these are all different qualities that are going to be differently alluring to different audiences. So choose the person who's the best fit for that platform, for that scenario in the moment. It could be a different person every time. And remember that you can also go on to interviews as a team. If somebody says, I want to invite the executive director, you can reply and be like, cool, the executive director is going to come with 3 of our artists. They might push back and be like, no, but you can offer that, right? You can make it a broader, more interesting scenario if you want. And this one, last one, put it in the budget. Don't be afraid to hire somebody who does this work, a consultant. A lot of what I wind up doing is working with people to try to help them brainstorm who they can reach, but also just publicists, communications consultants, a press firm. Hire somebody short-term who knows how to create angles out of what you do, and they already have the networks and the contacts. But when you hire somebody to do this, you're paying them for their labor, like for the time, but you're mainly paying for their knowledge of how to do it, how to write an incredibly great pitch email. You're paying for their strategy, like they know who to contact first, and then second and third, they know how to build out your strategy over maybe weeks. and you're paying for their connections. They already have a relationship with reporters in your area. Sometimes you'd be surprised by how easy it can be to fit that in your budget if you plan ahead. Like, you know, $1,000, a couple $1,000 to pay somebody to work on this for a few weeks. It can be really worth it in the end. Yes, I was going to say, I think that we're right at the last 5 minutes. And if you have questions, we can have time for question and answer, but I do not have to leave this slide up. So I'm gonna bail from my screen sharing. And with the last few minutes that we have together, if you all have any questions, you're welcome to throw them my way via chat or just unmute yourself and toss it out to us. Or if you have questions for each other, or if you're like, hey, during my brainstorming session, I mentioned this and I want feedback from more people now. Oh, thank you, Matt. The professional PR person has been invaluable. Yes, same for me. The people that I have hired for my projects to do work, invaluable. Yeah. Would you mind saying like a word or two about what made them invaluable? What did they do that you couldn't do?
Yeah, so I mean, we've had, in particular, we've had a good relationship with one PR firm that's just been, you know, kind of mission aligned and sees things the way we do. So that's been helpful in many cases, but especially when we've been doing planning, he's just made especially like online surveys and abilities to like present and represent that data in ways that are meaningful to different stakeholders. He can do like a wizard, and you know, I would just be tearing my hair out. And so that's been one place where it's been obvious. But I think there's also something to be said just for folks in that industry are very practiced at getting to a targeted message that is precise quickly. And so that also has saved a lot of time in terms of finding how best to communicate something when that's a need, which it always is.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else, ideas or questions? Ideas that you want to share, that something that went well for you, like what Matt was sharing, something that's gone well for him that you want to recommend to others check out, or a question that you have? Oh, good question. The popular desire to hit social media hard. There's a digital divide. I mean, that's where it can be so great to have a team, right? Like if you have, and I know it can be a privilege and it's a resourcing issue sometimes, but having somebody who's willing to make sure that you're present on social media, but also have people who are making sure that you're showing up in other spaces and places. And some of that audience, like where are they? What are they watching? Where are they showing up? Can help drill down to like, okay, this audience is not online. Okay, so where are we going to have to go and make sure that something shows up for them? And sometimes that can get into the territory of like partnering with events, like what's an event that they show up at, and then how can I make sure that either literature about what I do is there, or can I be the opener of the event and slide in an announcement about what I'm doing or something like that, or exhibit something that I'm doing at that event that would catch their interest. Yeah, that's a great point. Making sure that things are online is not going to meet every audience. It's only going to meet some of them. Oh, I see a hand, Lauren. Yeah.
What you just said about sliding into event, one of the things that we found really helpful is when we do with our fellowship program. So most of the work they do is creativity workshops or things like that. But where the public sees them a lot is when they're also opera singers. So when they're performing and doing what might be more traditional sort of stuff. So we make sure that before we do any of those things, there's always some sort of information in like program material. And usually, you know, a verbal announcement and welcoming of like, you're seeing them here today, but here's the other stuff they're also doing. You know, 80% of their job is leading creativity workshops. You know, they're magical creative unicorns. So they're singing this beautifully for you. And then during the week, they're also doing these other things. And that's been really important for us to connect our traditional opera audience with this really different work that we're doing as part of the fellowship. So trying to kind of build those bridges a little bit.
I love it. Thank you. And I imagine that some of the people in the audience are like, you know, they could be really moved by just that suggestion of like, can you imagine what it would be like to work like with this person in some kind of setting? That'd be amazing. Yeah, just like a way to build excitement. Thank you all so much for letting me share with you. And I am happy to hear from you if you want to send me an email or get in touch. And obviously, like Lynn said, get in touch with any of the technical assistants or reach out to one another. And I'm going to push it over to Catherine to wrap us up.
That was a really cool session. That gave me a lot of ideas. I feel really inspired. Thank you so much, Tasha.
Thank you.